Did you know that there are 20,000 3-second moments that happen every single day, and yet the vast majority of them we totally forget? In this video, I'm gonna unpack 8 really cool opening lines, or 8 ways to start off a meeting or a class or a workshop or a training in a way that will help you answer the question, how do you facilitate cooperative learning? There's so much wisdom that comes from learning from the group. And so how do we pull that all together? These 8 methods actually came from a client. I worked with a few hundred faculty and instructors and staff at Ohio State University. And after it, he's been watching my videos, and he shared this list of 8 really great, he calls them tips for teaching great opening lines for impact. And I thought it was just such a beautiful list. I am going to share my own take on it. I'm going to share them right after this intro. I'm going to share all 8 of them with you. And then if you want to jump to a specific one, you can look in the timestamps below and jump straight to it. But for each one, I'll give a really concrete example from my own teaching and facilitation, working with some of the top universities and organizations on the planet. I'm Chad Littlefield, happy to be in cyberspace with you. Let's get into it. The way that I want to unpack these is I want to share what the tip is from Brian Raisin, who's the professor at Ohio State that sent me this list. And then I want to share an example from my own teaching and workshop facilitation and speaking. Because when I'm leading a group, when I've got 300 people on Zoom, I am really deliberate about the first 3 seconds. Right? So even in the way that I started this video by saying there are 20,000 3-second moments and we forget most of them, I don't want the first 3 seconds to be forgotten. I don't want to come on and just say, good morning, hello, how was your weekend, right? I want to start in a way that is memorable, that activates people's brain, and that helps facilitate cooperative learning, that helps bring people together to create this atmosphere that they want to engage and learn from each other. And one of my clients says that you do, and he works at a university as well, he says you do 90% of your teaching during syllabus week, right? In the culture that you set. If you don't set the foundation for cooperative learning, you can expect it to not happen for the rest of the semester. So in 23 seconds to just unpack what's in my brain and Brian Raisin's brain and put it in yours, I'm just gonna list off all 8. So here they are, rapid fire, and we'll fill up the screen with them. Number 1, start with a startling statistic, surprise, unexpected fact. 2, open with a quotation. Use a thinking analogy. Ask a rhetorical or challenging question. Deploy a quiz or a survey at the very beginning. Number 6, tell a personal story. Number 8, bring a prop. So those are the 8. The brilliance comes in the examples. So stick around. I'm going to share one by one a really concrete example that I've used in my own work. I kind of already started one, right? I began the video with a startling statistic, surprise, or unexpected fact, right? You probably haven't considered the fact that there's 20,000 3-second moments every day and we forget 98% of them on a given day, right? And so that attention grabbing kind of turns people's brains on. Number 2, open with a quotation. I find this one immensely useful, extremely easy to implement, and it totally changes the context for people, right? In the very beginning, you want to create some context hook that loops people in and makes their brain go whoop, kind of turn on. And for me, I use the quotes that come in the deck of We Engage cards that we created. And there's actually well, let me show you the quote first. I'll show you this. So the quote that I'll often open up with to facilitate cooperative learning is this idea from Bill Nye, the science guy, that everyone you will ever meet knows something you don't. The moment I say that, it changes the context for any breakout session that I might do on Zoom, any sort of interaction that I'll be doing in person, right? The perspective that whoever's in your group, no matter whether they're younger, older, more experienced, less experienced, they've got something in their brain that you don't have in your own, right? So using a quotation to help frame that context. This quote comes from a deck that I created called We Engage cards. And there's a bunch of quotes on one side and images on the other. Ton of really cool cooperative learning exercises to get people connected and engaged beyond the like run-of-the-mill meeting. So if those are useful, there's a link to download them for free. A digital version for free. If you want the actual deck shipped to you, there's also a link to that below, and you can check those out. But quotes immediately set a really fantastic context and a learning environment. And you can pick whichever quote will set the environment that you want to actually create in the moment. Number 3 is use a thinking analogy. Analogies and metaphors are so powerful because they can make things that are very abstract or seemingly irrelevant directly relevant to someone's context. The best example recently from a metaphor that I just absolutely loved was from Jerry Seinfeld, and he's gonna be better at delivering it than I possibly will. So I'm gonna freeze me and check out Jerry for 17 seconds.
Getting live laughs is a druggy kind of lifestyle. Adrenaline, dopamine, oxytocin. The drugstore of the brain does not ask if you have a prescription. It's like those yogurt places where they let you pull the handle yourself.
Right, like you're immediately taken into this world, and whether you've been a stand-up comedian or not, you probably know what it's like to be at a buffet or a frozen yogurt place and just to pull that handle and be like, it's just gonna keep coming out, right? So it makes something that might not be relevant to your students or your team, makes it immediately relevant because it's using something that they're familiar with. And so that's the power of using a thinking analogy. Number 4 is ask a rhetorical or challenging question. I like the example, I do this very often, in particular because me and Will wrote a book about asking powerful questions. And so oftentimes if I'm leading a workshop on that, it's pretty fitting to just start off with a question. So I might start off with a question like, and sometimes I make mine not rhetorical. So I might start off with something like, when you meet another human being for the first time, what questions do you typically ask? And even in a crowd of 1,000 or a crowd of 200 online, I will popcorn out, or a crowd of 8,000 online too in a webinar format. I'll invite people to chat in. What questions do we typically ask? And when I ask that, it typically comes back with responses like, how are you? Where are you from? What do you do? Etc. Like even in a group of 1,000, we come up with the same like 4 to 5 questions right off the top of our head. Sets a beautiful framing, right? I've now invited the group's perspective into that cooperative learning. So let me learn from you. Let me live out that quote that I held up to you earlier, and actually pick your brain, get your perspective before I dive into content, sharing you how to ask questions that break outside of that 4 to 5 rut. So for me, for my content, that helps me situate content. The example that Brian uses that I really appreciate is, and he invites people not to raise their hands for this or not to kind of be called out to make it a little bit more psychologically safe. But he says, in your minds, raise your hands if you know the feeling when those blue flashing lights show up behind you and you're in your car driving, right? That immediate adrenaline rush, whatever that is. And so that question, such a good way if you're in a biology class to talk about a fight or flight response or to introduce the amygdala, right? But with something that everybody understands right off the bat. And again, as I'm sharing these are opening lines. These just help you frame the context. They help set the environment and the tone for a really great learning environment. Number 5 is deploy a quiz or a survey. So this time I wouldn't make rhetorical. I'll actually invite people to raise their hands. And one of the ways that I use this one personally is I'll ask people if they have any siblings or nieces and nephews who are about this tall, right? So somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5 years old. And depending on the group, some people might raise their hands. So siblings, nieces, nephews, kids, etc. But there's always somebody who doesn't, right? There's always somebody who's 22 and single and he doesn't have a big extended family. And so I'll ask to introduce some humor into it as well. If I see that everybody doesn't have their hand raised, I'll ask, and how many of you at some point in your life were a kid about this tall? Ages 3 to 5, right? And everybody's hand goes up. The reason I might start off with that little 2-question survey is 1, for a little bit of engagement and humor, but 2, it helps set the tone really well for what I'm going to talk about or share next in that workshop. And in that case, I might talk about how the way our brains actually develop, right? So if any of you know a kid who's between 3 to 5, they ask the question, why? over and over and over again. So our brains get really well rooted in the pathway of asking questions that begin with why. And yet, in the book, we talk about and invite people to cut why out of their vocabulary and ask questions that only begin with how or what, because it tends to create less judgment or tends to put less judgment on that person. So if the aim is to build a relationship of trust with that person, letting go of why questions. But do you see how that quiz and survey, like I'm engaging them, I'm involving them in the process. I'm making them realize that I'm not just talking about how brains develop, I'm talking about how their brain developed when they were 3 to 5. And so that is really, that's personalizing learning in a really beautiful way. Number 6, tell a personal story. I don't really understand all of the neuroscience and psychology behind why our brains are wired so much for story. I can point to the fact that this is, since humans have existed, we've gathered around in circles and around fires and told stories to each other, right? Before written word, we had word of mouth. And so there's just something in our brains that loves stories. And I can see this actually when I'm speaking, both on in a virtual context and in person. When I'm sharing an idea and I start telling a story, the group leans in. And so one of the ones that I'll share oftentimes as a framing in the beginning starts like this. 15 minutes before I got married, I was asked one of the most powerful questions that I have ever received in my own life. And it changed the way that I experienced that day, and it changed the nature of my relationship with my wife. Woo, okay, so like right there, like, what was the question, right? It creates that draw, that curiosity gap, and when we hear a story, we relate to people. Now I will add something to this. This is a personal challenge that I try to take on. I don't know how good of a job I'm doing in this video of it, but the personal challenge is I try to share my own failures and missteps and other people's successes, right? So sharing my own failures, missteps, mistakes, and other people's successes, because those stories are way more relatable than if you just come on and say, look how awesome I am. These are 17 ways that I'm awesome. Part of the reason that I wanted to elevate Brian and his list of 8 is I could have made this video based on all of my own ideas and things that I've tried, but it's more meaningful if it comes as a success story from somebody you know. And so think about that. And to help me keep a log of all the stories of failures and missteps, I actually keep a failure resume. So I have a Google Doc that I update every time I make some stupid mistake or do something that doesn't land very well. I add it to my failure resume, and anytime I need to pull in a story or an opening line for a workshop, I can go to that story bank to kind of cue my brain. Number 7 in Brian's language is note the occasion. So I think about, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to, right? It immediately sets the context for that. We've heard that phrase before at a wedding. So you can note the occasion, but the way that he frames it actually or describes it is, I would actually say is note the occasion and state the intention. Note the occasion and state the intention. And I'm adding the state the intention part because I think if we begin a gathering and the intention isn't crystal clear from the very beginning, we risk going very off route and off track. Number 8, bring a prop. This is especially valuable in a virtual learning and a virtual connection context. But when you bring visuals, the brain is wired to take in visual data and encode it into long-term memory, whereas the brain is wired to take language and numbers and encode them into short-term memory. If I'm kicking off a workshop and we're gonna be unpacking chapter 3 of Ask Powerful Questions on listening, I might immediately start off by saying, our intention here is to talk about how these have the effect to change what happens in this. Now having a visual for that, when I say a phrase like, the way that we listen has the power to change what people say, right? People's brains will actually remember that or be more likely to remember that because there's been that visual component associated with it. So props are just a fantastic idea. It's cool too if you're in a virtual context. I had a client once who I was coaching around storytelling at a big annual conference they were having for their organization. And we were on Zoom, and he had this really cool background with a bunch of stuff. And I asked him if there was any item on his back wall that had a story that might really bring something to life. And so all these 8 techniques you can also combine, right? So I might reach back here and grab my throwable microphone and talk about Catchbox and the awesome work that they do creating audience engagement, and how I use this in an audience to break that sage on the stage dynamic, right? There's just something about when you interact with your space that just brings a little bit more life and curiosity and dynamicness to your team meeting. I'm Chad Littlefield. It was awesome hanging out in cyberspace with you. If you like this video, you'll love these ones. Have an awesome day.